A man was led before a firing squad, stripped and forced to kneel in the freezing snow. Broken and half mad, he was then sent to Siberia for 4 years of brutal labor. But instead of destroying him, it forged him. He excavated the human soul with the intensity of one who had stared into the abyss and dared to look back, giving voice to the murderer, the saint, the gambler, the prophet, and the fool, making you see them within yourself. They times created, times him. His name is Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. Did not merely write stories. He was the man who asked the questions that no one else in the 19th century had the courage or the madness to ask. Moscow, November 11, Lapenblas 20 Sata. The world into which Fyodor Dostoevsky was born was one of violent contradictions. And in that sense, the world matched the man perfectly. Russia, in the early 19th century, was an empire straining under the weight of its own contradictions. The court of Tsar Alexander I, dazzled with French fashions, German philosophy, and Italian opera. But beyond the gilded drawing rooms of St. Petersburg, an ancient peasant world endured in squalor, bound by serfdom, a form of feudal slavery that enslaved the vast majority of Russia's population to the land and to the aristocrats who owned it. Fyodor was the second of 7 children born to Mikhail Andreevich Dostoevsky, a military doctor of the lower nobility, and his wife Maria Fyodorovna, a woman of warmth and devout religious faith. The family lived within the walls of the Maryinsky Hospital for the Poor in Moscow, a detail that would prove prophetically symbolic. Before we move further, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your support means the world to me and helps this channel grow, allowing us to bring more powerful stories to light. Thank you for being part of this journey. From his earliest years, young Fyodor fell asleep to the sounds of suffering. The moans of the sick, the prayers of the dying, the grinding poverty of men and women who had nowhere else to go. His father, Mikhail, was a complicated and difficult man. By many accounts, he was intelligent and educated, yet prone to fits of tyrannical anger that terrorized his household. He drank, he raged, he lorded over his family with the erratic authority of a man who felt himself perpetually one step away from poverty and humiliation. The Dostoevsky home was not a place of serene bourgeois comfort. It was a pressure cooker of fear, ambition, piety, and barely contained violence. And yet it was also a home of books. Maria Fyodorovna read to her children every night the Bible, Karamzin's Times, History of the Russian State, the fairy tales of the Russian countryside, full of demons and saints and impossible moral tests. From his mother, Fyodor absorbed not only the cadence of storytelling, but the conviction that stories were sacred, that they carried truths too large for any other vessel. By the time he was 10 years old, Fyodor had already read Pushkin, Homer, and the Gothic novels of Anne Radcliffe. He had a particular and lifelong passion for Don Quixote Cervantes's tale of a man driven mad by his own idealism, a man who could not reconcile the world as it was with the world as it ought to be. It is not difficult to see why. Then, when Fyodor was 15, tragedy arrived without warning. His mother died of tuberculosis in February 1837. She was 36 years old. The effect on the family was immediate and shattering. Mikhail, unmoored by grief, sent his 2 eldest sons, Fyodor and his brother Mikhail, his closest companion, away to the Nikolaev Military Engineering Academy in St. Petersburg. It was a practical decision, and a cruel one. It tore the brothers from everything familiar and deposited them in a military institution that had no interest in their literary sensibilities. St. Petersburg in 1837 was Russia's imperial showcase, a city of grand boulevards, colonnaded palaces, and the brutal logic of rank and order. But it was also a city of suffocating poverty beneath its shining surface. In the wretched tenements and fog-choked canals of its poorer quarters, tens of thousands of people scrambled to survive: civil servants, ruined nobles, prostitutes, students, dreamers, drunkards. Dostoevsky absorbed all of it, obsessively, like a man who has been told the world's secret but cannot yet decode it. He endured the academy. He was never a natural soldier, never comfortable with its rigid hierarchies and contempt for intellectual life. He made few friends. He read voraciously in private, and he waited. Then, in 1839, the second catastrophe struck. His father, Mikhail Andreevich Dostoevsky, was murdered. The exact circumstances remain disputed to this day. The most commonly accepted account holds that Mikhail had retired to a small estate he had purchased south of Moscow, where his cruelty toward the serfs had become intolerable. One evening, a group of his serfs men he had brutalized dragged him from his carriage and beat him to death in the road. Dostoevsky was 17 years old when he received the news. The psychological shock was so severe that he reportedly suffered his first epileptic seizure shortly thereafter, an illness that would afflict him for the rest of his life, unpredictably, humiliatingly, with terrifying violence. Some biographers have argued that Fyodor never fully recovered from his father's murder, not psychologically. That the question of patricide, the killing of a father, haunted him for the rest of his life, eventually finding its ultimate expression in his final and greatest novel, The Brothers Karamazov, published just months before his own death. He had barely begun to live, and already suffering had become his native language. Dostoevsky graduated from the Engineering Academy in 1843. He was 22 years old. He immediately resigned his commission. He had not the slightest intention of becoming a military engineer. He was going to be a writer. The confidence of that declaration is almost breathtaking when you consider his circumstances. He had no money. He had no influential patron. He was entirely unknown. St. Petersburg's literary world was presided over by titans. Pushkin had died dramatically in a duel just years before, but his ghost still dominated every conversation. Ivan Turgenev was emerging as an elegant voice of the intelligentsia. Nikolai Gogol, the great satirist and master of the grotesque, was the reigning genius of Russian prose. Into this formidable company, the 22-year-old Dostoevsky proposed to insert himself. He spent the winter of 1844 to 1845 writing his first novel in a feverish state of almost manic concentration, surviving on almost nothing, borrowing money constantly, writing through the night, by candlelight. The result was Time's Poor Folk. Times, an epistolary novel told entirely through the letters of two impoverished St. Petersburg residents, a lonely, aging civil servant named Makar Devushkin, and a young seamstress named Varvara Dobrosolova. It was a novel about dignity, about the desperate, aching need of the poor to be seen as human, to matter to someone, to be loved, to leave behind some trace of their existence. Dostoevsky, in a moment of extraordinary boldness, sent the manuscript to Dmitry Grigorovich, a literary acquaintance, who immediately passed it along to the most powerful literary critic in Russia, Vissarion Belinsky. What happened next is the stuff of literary legend. Belinsky, the fierce, ideologically driven arbiter of Russian letters, a man not given to easy praise read times, poor folk times through the night. By morning, he was nearly weeping. He declared that a new genius had arrived in Russian literature. He summoned Dostoevsky to his apartment. When the young writer arrived, Belinsky reportedly seized him by the shoulders and told him, "Do you understand yourself what you have written?" It was an instantaneous, total, transformative triumph. Overnight, Dostoevsky became the talk of St. Petersburg society. He was invited to the fashionable literary circles, feted as a prodigy, celebrated as the natural heir to Gogol. For a young man who had grown up in poverty and grief and exile from everything comfortable, this sudden ascent into fame was intoxicating. But Dostoevsky, being Dostoevsky, was constitutionally incapable of taking the easy path. His second novel, The Double, published just months later, was a strange, unsettling, psychologically radical story of a man who encounters his own doppelganger, his other self, and is slowly destroyed by the encounter. The literary establishment was baffled. They had expected another touching story of the poor. They got something far stranger and more disturbing. An exploration of fractured identity, persecution mania, and the terror of self-knowledge. Belinsky was disappointed. The critics were dismissive. Dostoevsky, who had briefly been the darling of St. Petersburg, found himself suddenly unfashionable. He didn't care, or rather he cared enormously, desperately, in the raw and wounded way he cared about everything, but he did not change course. By the late 1840s, Dostoevsky had become caught up in the fevered intellectual atmosphere of his generation. Russia was gripped by the great debate between the Westernizers, those who believed Russia must follow Europe's path toward liberal democracy and rational progress, and the Slavophiles, who argued that Russia had its own unique spiritual destiny rooted in Orthodox Christianity and peasant communal life. Dostoevsky was a passionate participant in these discussions. He joined the Petrashevsky Circle, a group of young Russian intellectuals who gathered on Friday evenings at the apartment of Mikhail Petrashevsky to debate socialism, utopian theory, and the liberation of the serfs. They read forbidden literature. They discussed revolutionary ideas. Some of the more radical members spoke of organizing underground printing presses to spread seditious literature across Russia. It was enough to destroy him. On April 23, 1849, in the early hours of the morning, soldiers of the 3rd Section, the Tsar's secret police, hammered on doors across St. Petersburg and arrested 40 members of the Petrashevsky Circle. Among them was 27-year-old Fyodor Dostoevsky. He was charged with conspiracy against the state. For 8 months, Dostoevsky was held in the Peter and Paul Fortress, the most feared prison in Russia, built by Peter the Great on an island in the Neva River, a place where political prisoners had been held for over a century. He was interrogated repeatedly. He was held in isolation. He continued to write, secretly, on whatever scraps of paper he could conceal. In November 1849, he and 20 other prisoners were informed that they had been tried in absentia and sentenced to death. They were not told exactly when the execution would take place. December 22nd, 1849, St. Petersburg is locked in winter. At 6 in the morning, the prisoners were roused from their cells, dressed in white execution hoods and shrouds, the traditional garments of condemned men, and marched out into Semyonovsky Square. A large crowd had gathered to watch. The prisoners were led to the wooden execution posts. The first 3 were tied in place. A priest administered last rites. The firing squad raised their rifles. Fyodor Dostoevsky was in the second group. He had perhaps 2 or 3 minutes left to live. He later described those minutes with terrifying lucidity. A fellow prisoner, the poet Speshnev, leaned close and whispered, "We will be with Christ." Dostoevsky replied, "A handful of dust." Whether that exchange reflected genuine doubt or a kind of dark, gallows humor, no one can say with certainty. What is certain is that Dostoevsky stood in that square and looked at the world, the gray sky, the snow-covered cobblestones, the faces of the crowd, and prepared himself to leave it. Then, a drum roll, a messenger on horseback, an announcement. The Tsar had commuted their sentences. The entire execution had been staged on Tsar Nicholas I's personal orders as a punishment in itself, a lesson in absolute imperial power, delivered not through death, but through the psychological devastation of facing death and being denied it at the last possible moment. It worked. One of the prisoners lost his mind on the spot and never fully recovered. Others wept. Others stood in a kind of blank, shattered silence. Dostoevsky was sent back to his cell, but not for long. Within days he was in chains, being transported by sledge across the frozen wastes of Siberia. He was bound for 4 years of hard labor at the Omsk prison camp. After that, a compulsory military service in Siberia. He would not return to St. Petersburg for 10 years. He was 28 years old. The Omsk prison camp was a place of extraordinary brutality. Dostoevsky, a gentleman, an intellectual, a published author, was thrown together with some of the most hardened criminals in Russia, murderers, thieves, men who had been exiled for crimes that would make any civilized person recoil in horror. He slept in overcrowded, lice-ridden barracks. He performed brutal physical labor, hauling bricks, breaking ice, shoveling snow in temperatures that could drop to -40 degrees. He wore leg irons that were not removed even while he slept. He ate rotten food. He received no special treatment. In fact, he received worse treatment than most because the other prisoners despised him as an intellectual, a nobleman, an outsider who could not truly belong in their world. And yet something extraordinary happened in those 4 years. Dostoevsky was forced into intimate proximity with men from the Russian peasant world he had previously known only through literature and theory. He could not escape them. He slept beside them, ate beside them, suffered beside them, and gradually, painfully, reluctantly, he began to see them not as symbols of suffering to be pitied from a comfortable distance, but as human beings of staggering complexity, cruel and tender, superstitious and wise, capable of astonishing generosity and savage violence, animated by a faith in God so deep and unironic that it left Dostoevsky, the intellectual, the skeptic, utterly shaken. His experience in Siberia destroyed his youthful socialist idealism. He had gone to prison believing, as many of his generation did, that human suffering was primarily a product of unjust social structures, that if you reformed society, if you liberated the serfs, if you redistributed wealth and built rational institutions, you could eliminate evil and create human happiness. What he discovered in Omsk was that evil was not primarily structural, it was personal. It lived inside each individual human heart, in his time's heart, as much as in the heart of the most brutal murderer sharing his bunk. And if that was true, then the socialist dream of perfecting humanity through the perfection of society was not merely idealistic, it was dangerously, catastrophically wrong. He came out of Siberia, transformed, broken, and rebuilt. A Christian, though, of a deeply unorthodox, tormented, questioning kind. A Russian nationalist, devoted to the spiritual uniqueness of the Russian peasant. An anti-revolutionary, a man who had been to the bottom of human experience and had come back with something to say. He also came back with epilepsy worsening, chronic lung problems, no money, no connections, and 10 years of literary silence to overcome. He began to write again immediately. The decade of the 1860s was one of the most productive and turbulent in Russian intellectual life. Tsar Alexander II, more liberal than his father Nicholas, had emancipated the serfs in 1861, but the aftermath of emancipation was chaos and disillusionment. A new generation of young Russian radicals, the nihilists, had emerged, rejecting all traditional values, religion, family, aesthetics, even morality itself, in the name of a cold, scientific materialism. They believed that if God was dead, everything was permitted, and the only meaningful action was revolutionary destruction. These ideas terrified Dostoevsky. He was also, at this precise moment, almost entirely broke. In 1864, he published what many philosophers now consider one of the most important works of the 19th century, Notes from Underground. It is a short book, barely a novella, narrated by an anonymous middle-aged civil servant in St. Petersburg. The Underground Man, as he is called, is one of the strangest, most infuriating, most uncomfortable characters in all of literature. He is petty, he is spiteful, he is humiliated by his own intelligence. He is aware of all his faults and utterly incapable of correcting them. He argues passionately, almost brilliantly, against the entire Enlightenment project of rational self-improvement, against the idea that human beings are fundamentally rational creatures who, once shown the correct path, will choose the good. Shower upon him every earthly blessing, the underground man declares, and he'll play you such a trick that you'll be amazed at him. The underground man insists that human beings will always, inevitably, destructively choose freedom over happiness, even if that freedom leads only to suffering. Because the only alternative to freedom, he argues, is a kind of living death, the reduction of human beings to predictable machines. For the first time in European literature, a writer had created a character who argued seriously, cogently, and from personal experience, against the rational optimism that had defined Western thought since the Enlightenment. It was a philosophical grenade thrown into the middle of modernity. The existentialists of the 20th century, Sartre, Camus, Heidegger, would return to the underground man again and again. Nietzsche would read Dostoevsky and declare him the only psychologist who had ever taught him anything. Sigmund Freud would study his work obsessively. But in 1864, almost nobody noticed. Notes from Underground Times was published to critical indifference. Dostoevsky didn't have time to be wounded by this. He had debts to pay, a magazine to run, and a demon at his back. In 1866, he published Times, Crime and Punishment Times, and this time, the world paid attention. The novel follows Rodion Raskolnikov, a young, brilliant, poverty-stricken student in St. Petersburg, who murders an elderly pawnbroker woman with an axe. His justification is an elaborate philosophical theory. He believes that extraordinary individuals, Napoleons, Caesars, men of historical destiny, are not bound by ordinary moral law. They have the right, even the duty, to transgress conventional morality in the service of a higher purpose. Raskolnikov believes he is such a man. The murder, in his mind, is a test of his own exceptionalism. What follows is not simply a detective story, though it functions brilliantly as one. What follows is the complete psychological demolition of Raskolnikov's theory by reality itself. Because Raskolnikov discovers, in the most visceral and agonizing way, that he is not Napoleon. He cannot kill without moral consequence. He cannot sever himself from his own conscience. The murder, rather than proving his superiority, begins to tear him apart from the inside, through guilt, through paranoia, through fever, through the relentless pursuit of the brilliant investigator Porfiry Petrovich, who seems to know Raskolnikov's guilt through pure psychological intuition before he has a single piece of physical evidence. The novel is many things simultaneously: a psychological thriller, a philosophical debate, a social critique of radical ideology, a love story, and at its deepest level, a religious parable about pride, suffering, and the possibility of redemption. What makes it revolutionary is Dostoevsky's technique. He does not narrate Raskolnikov from the outside, with the comfortable distance of an omniscient author passing moral judgment. He inhabits Raskolnikov from the inside, renders his rationalizations with such intelligence and force that the reader is made to times understand times them, to feel their seductive logic, before watching them collapse. Crime and Punishment Times was serialized in a literary journal throughout 1866 and was an immediate sensation. It made Dostoevsky one of the most widely read authors in Russia. It established a template for the psychological novel that writers from Kafka to Camus to Nabokov would inherit and transform. But he wrote it under conditions that would have broken most people entirely. He was simultaneously working with an inexperienced young stenographer named Anna Grigorievna Snitkina to meet a different, ruinous deadline on a separate novel, Times the Gambler, times that he was contractually obligated to deliver in 26 days, or forfeit all future rights to his own work, to a predatory publisher. He met the deadline. Then he married the stenographer. It was the best decision of his life. Anna Grigorievna Dostoevskaya would spend the rest of her life managing the chaos that was her husband. She was his secretary, his financial manager, his nurse, his publisher, his shield against the world. She loved him with a clear-eyed, practical devotion that is almost as remarkable as anything he wrote. He needed managing desperately, because Dostoevsky was, among his many other qualities, a catastrophic gambling addict. Beginning in 1865, he had discovered roulette at the European casino towns Baden-Baden, Wiesbaden, Geneva, and the compulsion to gamble was for him as powerful and as destructive as any epileptic seizure. He could not stop. He would win fortunes and lose them within hours. He would pawn his wife's wedding ring. He would beg money from friends, from publishers, from strangers. He would write to Anna from across a casino table, confessing his losses in anguished letters that mixed genuine remorse with transparent attempts to secure more funds. His novel Times, The Gambler, written in those 26 frenzied days, is the most autobiographical of all his fiction. A searing portrait of a man who understands perfectly that he is destroying himself and cannot stop. Written while he was actively destroying himself, it has a kind of terrible sincerity that no purely imagined account could replicate. But Anna's steady, brilliant, tireless Anna eventually broke the cycle. By 1871, after they had returned to Russia from 4 years of debt-ridden exile in Europe, Dostoevsky never gambled again. He simply stopped. As suddenly and completely as the compulsion had arrived, it was gone. He was free to write. In 1872, he published Times, Demons, Times known in some translations as Times, the Possessed, Times which many scholars consider his most overtly political novel and one of his most psychologically terrifying. The novel was inspired by a real historical event. In 1869, a young revolutionary named Sergei Nikhaev had organized a small conspiratorial cell in Moscow, manipulated its members through lies and blackmail, and ultimately arranged the murder of a student member he suspected of wavering commitment in order to bind the others to him through complicity in blood. Dostoevsky was horrified and fascinated. In Times, Demons, he transposed this event to a provincial Russian town and used it to dissect, with savage precision, what he saw as the spiritual pathology of the revolutionary generation, its grandiosity, its nihilism, its contempt for ordinary human life, its readiness to sacrifice real people on the altar of abstract ideology. The novel's central figure, Pyotr Verkovensky, modeled on Nikhaev, is one of the most chilling villains in literature. Not a monster in any obvious sense, but a man of magnetic energy, strategic brilliance, and total moral vacancy. He is charming and purposeful and utterly without conscience. He believes in nothing, not even the revolutionary ideology he preaches, and uses others' idealism as a tool for his own power. But the novel's philosophical center is the magnificent, doomed figure of Nikolai Stavrogin, the charismatic aristocrat whose influence has corrupted everyone around him, whose intelligence and beauty mask a total spiritual emptiness. Stavrogin has passed through every experience, every belief, every transgression, and found nothing that gives his life meaning. He is, perhaps, the most psychologically modern character Dostoevsky ever created. A man destroyed not by poverty or oppression, but by the very freedom that the modern world offers. A freedom that, without God, without transcendence, without love, becomes indistinguishable from nothingness. In November 1880, the final installment of Times, the Brothers Karamazov Times, appeared in a Russian literary journal. It was Dostoevsky's last novel, and it is, by almost universal critical consensus, his masterpiece and one of the greatest novels in the history of world literature. The novel tells the story of the three Karamazov brothers, Dmitri, the passionate and self-destructive sensualist, Ivan, the brilliant and tormented intellectual atheist, and Alyosha, the gentle, devout novice monk, and their father, Fyodor Karamazov, a vile, comic, avaricious, old reprobate. When the father is murdered, Dmitri is accused of the crime. But the question of who actually killed him and who bears moral responsibility opens into something far larger than any murder mystery. The novel contains, within its vast architecture, debates about the existence of God, the problem of evil, the justice of punishment, the meaning of suffering, the nature of freedom, the possibility of redemption, and the question of whether a universe that permits the suffering of innocent children can be forgiven. The most famous passage in the entire novel, indeed, one of the most famous passages in world literature, is Ivan's rebellion chapter, in which Ivan Karamazov makes the most powerful argument against God's existence and justice that has ever appeared in a work of fiction. Ivan does not deny that God exists. He simply refuses to accept God's world, refuses to reconcile himself to a universe in which innocent children suffer. He tells Alyosha that even if God ultimately explains everything, justifies everything, achieves a universal harmony at the end of time, he, Ivan, returns the ticket. It's not God I don't accept, it's the world he created. It is an argument that Dostoevsky, who was himself a believer, presents with such devastating force that many readers assume it represents his own view. It does not, quite. But Dostoevsky understood, as perhaps no other writer ever has, that faith that has not confronted the strongest possible argument against itself is not really faith at all. It is just comfort. Ivan's argument is answered, not refuted by the figure of Father Zosima, the ancient, loving monastery elder, and by the life of Alyosha himself. The answer Dostoevsky offers to Ivan's intellectual rebellion is not a counter-argument. It is a life. It is the practice of love, active, concrete, particular love for real people, in real moments. Love one another, Zosima says. Love all of God's creation, both the whole of it and every grain of sand. Love every little leaf, every ray of light. It is the most beautiful statement of faith in all of Dostoevsky's work, and it is inseparable from the darkness that surrounds it. Within Times, the Brothers Karamazov Times is a chapter that has a life entirely of its own, a text that scholars and philosophers have treated as one of the most important works of modern philosophy, extracted from its novelistic context and studied on its own terms. The Legend of the Grand Inquisitor is a story within a story, composed by Ivan Karamazov and narrated to his brother Alyosha. In it, Christ returns to Earth during the Spanish Inquisition and is immediately arrested by the Grand Inquisitor, the elderly, powerful head of the church, who tells Christ, in a long and remarkable monologue, that Christ made a terrible mistake by offering humanity freedom. The Grand Inquisitor's argument is this: human beings do not want freedom. They cannot bear it. Freedom is a burden. It demands responsibility, choice, the constant anguish of uncertainty. What human beings actually want is bread, miracle, and authority. They want to be fed, to be given signs from above, and to be told what to do. The Church, the Inquisitor's Church, has corrected Christ's error. It has taken freedom from humanity and given them happiness instead. And now, Christ has returned to disrupt this arrangement. Throughout the entire monologue, Christ says nothing. He simply listens. At the end, instead of replying, Christ steps forward and kisses the old man on the lips. The Grand Inquisitor releases him, tells him never to return. Christ leaves in silence. It is one of the most devastating scenes in all of literature. The kiss is not a refutation of the Inquisitor's argument. It is something else entirely. An act of love toward the man who has imprisoned him. A love that does not argue, does not triumph, does not demand. It simply is. The legend of the Grand Inquisitor has been cited by Friedrich Nietzsche, by Sigmund Freud, by Albert Camus, by Hannah Arendt, by Pope Benedict XVI, by countless philosophers and theologians and political scientists as one of the most penetrating analyses of the relationship between freedom, authority, and human happiness ever written. It was composed by a man who had faced a firing squad, survived a Siberian prison camp, struggled with gambling addiction and epilepsy and poverty, who had buried children and lived on the edge of financial ruin for most of his adult life. It may be the most hard-earned wisdom in the history of world literature. To understand Dostoevsky's impact on the world, you have to understand the world he was writing into. The 19th century was the century of confident materialism. Darwin had published Times on the Origin of Species Times in 1859. Marx and Engels had published the Times Communist Manifesto Times in 1848. The sciences were advancing at a velocity that made everything previously believed about human beings seem suddenly provisional, threatened. God was, in Nietzsche's famous declaration, dead, or at least dying, in the minds of educated Europeans, replaced by rational science, economic determinism, evolutionary biology. Into this world, Dostoevsky threw a series of literary bombs. Friedrich Nietzsche, who rarely praised anyone, wrote that Dostoevsky was the only psychologist who had ever taught him anything. He encountered Dostoevsky's work late in his own career and was struck by the Russians' treatment of suffering, his refusal to see it as merely meaningless, his insistence that suffering could be, under certain conditions, transformative and creative. Sigmund Freud wrote an essay specifically about Dostoevsky times Dostoevsky and Parricide times, in which he analyzed the psychology of times the Brothers Karamazov times with the tools of psychoanalysis, arguing that the novel's obsession with patricide revealed Dostoevsky's own unresolved feelings about his murdered father. The essay is fascinating and deeply partial, missing much of what matters most in the novel. But the fact that Freud devoted a significant piece of work specifically to one novelist's work tells you something about the stature of that novelist. Franz Kafka said that reading Dostoevsky felt like looking into a mirror he didn't know existed. The nightmarish bureaucratic logic of times, the trial, times the sense of guilt without specified crime, the impossibility of knowing the rules of the system you are being judged by, has deep roots in the underground man's world. Albert Camus considered Dostoevsky's Ivan Karamazov one of the first genuine existential rebels, a man who does not simply disbelieve in God, but refuses to accept a universe that God has made. Camus' own essay Times, The Rebel Times, is in part a meditation on Ivan's position. Jean-Paul Sartre, defining existentialism, returned repeatedly to the formula: if God does not exist, everything is permitted. It is a line that appears in Times, The Brothers Karamazov. Times in the mouth of one character justifying another character's atheism. Sartre took it as the founding statement of existentialist ethics. The entire tradition of 20th century existentialism, one of the dominant philosophical and literary movements of the last century, is, to a remarkable degree, a prolonged response to questions that Dostoevsky asked in the 1860s and 1870s. And this was not merely an academic influence. In Russia itself, Dostoevsky's prophecies proved unnervingly literal. Demons Times, his satire of revolutionary nihilism, was written in 1872, 45 years before the Bolshevik Revolution. In it, Dostoevsky depicted, with almost prophetic precision, the psychology of the professional revolutionary, the contempt for ordinary human beings, the willingness to use murder as a political tool, the belief that the ends justify any conceivable means. He imagined Pyotr Verkovensky, and 40 years later, history produced Lenin and Stalin. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great chronicler of the Soviet Gulag, wrote that if the Russian intelligentsia had heeded Dostoevsky, the catastrophe of the 20th century might have been averted. That may be too much to ask of literature, but it is not too much to say that Dostoevsky saw it coming. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky died on the 28th of January 1881 in St. Petersburg. He was 59 years old. He died of a pulmonary hemorrhage, a rupture in the lung, likely the result of years of epileptic seizures and chronic illness, the accumulated damage of Siberia and poverty, and a life lived at maximum intensity in every direction. He had been working on the second volume of Times, the Brothers Karamazov Times, until nearly the last day. He never wrote it. His funeral procession was one of the largest St. Petersburg had ever seen. Tens of thousands of people followed his coffin through the streets. Students carried torches. Workers marched beside professors. There were delegations from literary societies, universities, theatrical companies, and in a detail that would have moved him deeply from communities of peasants and ordinary working people who had never set foot in a literary salon, but had read his novels in cheap serialized editions and felt, with absolute certainty, that he had understood them. He was buried in the Tikhvin cemetery at the Alexander Nevsky Monastery, the resting place of Russia's greatest figures. The inscription on his tombstone is a line from the Gospel of John, the verse that opens Times, the Brothers Karamazov. Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a grain of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone, but if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. In the century and a half since his death, Dostoevsky's reputation has never diminished. If anything, it has grown. His books have been translated into more than 170 languages. His novels are required reading in universities across every continent. Film directors from Akira Kurosawa to Woody Allen to Robert Bresson have adapted his work. Playwrights and opera composers have transformed his stories for the stage. His characters have become part of the common vocabulary of Western culture. The Underground Man, Raskolnikov, Ivan Karamazov, Prince Mishkin, Alyosha figures as recognizable in their way as Hamlet or Don Quixote. But why? Why does this man, who wrote about Russian peasants and students and monks in the 1860s and 1870s, matter to a reader in Tokyo or Lagos or Sao Paulo in the 21st century? The answer, perhaps, is this. Dostoevsky wrote about what it feels like to be human in a world that has stopped making sense. He wrote about the anguish of free will, the terrifying, exhilarating, inescapable burden of having to choose who you are and what you believe, in a universe that offers no guarantees, no certainties, no safety nets. He wrote about the gap between what we know is right and what we actually do, the universal human experience of understanding our own failings perfectly and being utterly unable, by reason alone, to correct them. He wrote about suffering not sentimentally, not theoretically, but from the inside, with the authority of a man who had suffered enormously and refused to look away from any of it. There is a reason that readers who encounter Dostoevsky for the first time often describe the experience as uncanny, as if someone had secretly read their most private thoughts and fears and laid them out on the page. He was a great artist, but he was also something rarer, a witness. He testified with absolute honesty to the full range of human experience, its darkness and its grace, its pettiness and its grandeur, its cruelty and its capacity for love. And he did so without flinching, without condescension, without the comfortable distance of irony. He believed, against all odds, and against all evidence, and against the entire intellectual current of his century, that human beings matter infinitely. That every soul, the murderer's soul, the saint's soul, the fool's soul, contains a depth that cannot be measured, a mystery that cannot be exhausted, a dignity that cannot be destroyed. That belief is what makes his books not merely great works of historical literature, but living, urgent things, Books that reach across a century and a half and grab you by the throat and demand that you look at yourself honestly. Fyodor Dostoevsky was led to a firing squad and survived. He was sent to Siberia and survived. He lost everything multiple times and survived. He wrote, in defiance of illness and poverty and grief and his own worst impulses, some of the greatest books in human history. He asked the hardest questions, the ones we still haven't answered. What is freedom for? Can suffering be redemptive? Is love enough to sustain a human life? What do we owe each other? Can a person who has done something truly terrible be forgiven, and can they forgive themselves? He didn't always provide the answers, but he asked the questions in a way that makes it impossible to stop thinking about them. And perhaps that the inability to stop thinking about them is the closest thing to wisdom the modern world has to offer. The questions Dostoevsky asked are still alive. They're alive in every courtroom where we debate justice and mercy. They're alive in every political movement that promises a perfect world, if only we trust it completely. They're alive every time a person stands at the edge of some private abyss and wonders whether there is any reason to go on. He lived in the 19th century. He speaks to the 21st. And he will speak to whatever century comes after that. So, let me ask you, which of Dostoevsky's great questions haunts you most? Is it the question of free will, the problem of innocent suffering, the possibility of redemption? Leave your thoughts below. And if you're drawn to these stories of artists and thinkers who change the way humanity understands itself, there are more untold stories waiting for you in Trueline Files.